Hi, today is December 13th, 2025, and here are my poems for the day. The first one is poem number 1927 for the year, Dick Van Dyke. Dick Van Dyke is 100 years old today. I remember him in that video last year by Coldplay. I remember him with Mary Moore on the Dick Van Dyke Show. I remember when he made the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang car go, flying over the sea, and I watched him gliding on rooftops when he was a chimney sweep in Mary Poppins. In almost every other dance number, in almost every other movie I saw back when I was a little boy, I groaned and rolled my eyes, but when Dick Van Dyke danced, I was mesmerized. Poem number 1928, Mary Poppins. You could tell that Mary Poppins had genuine and deep affection for Dick Van Dyke's lovable and sooty chimney sweep character. You could also tell that there was no way in hell that those two were ever going to bang. Poppins friend-zoned that poor bastard before that movie even got started. I don't know much about Julie Andrews. Maybe she would have gone for it, but Poppins certainly wasn't banging that sooty motherfucker. Poem number 1929, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. People say the Sherman brothers, who wrote the songs for Mary Poppins, were phoning it in when they wrote the songs for Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. But I like all the Chitty Chitty Bang Bang songs except for Lovely Lonely Man. And I thought the kids were cuter in Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, and I liked the story better too. I mean, it was written by Ian Fleming, and it's basically like James Bond for kids, so what's not to like? And Dick Van Dyke as the crackpot inventor who wasn't so crackpot after all, and whose kids believed in him, and who found a woman who could love him in spite or perhaps because of his eccentricities. Yes, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang had a lot going for it, and I would say it still does. Poem number 1930, Petrys versus Cramdens. And I watched the Dick Van Dyke Show too, and I was thinking about how the Petrys were a much happier and more stable couple than the Cramdens. The Cramdens made it work somehow, despite the bang zoom straight to the moon and other instances of implied violence. And the shouting, Rob Petrie's shouting was a joke compared to Ralph Cramden's. I was also thinking, well, Rob Petrie had a nicer job, comedy writer versus bus driver, and a nicer house, nicer home. 148 Bonnie Meadow Road, New Rochelle versus 328 Chauncey Street, Bensonhurst. And I can see now that the Honeymooners versus the Dick Van Dyke Show is a real study in class struggle. We live and we learn. Poem number 1931, Petrie's Office. It was lovely to visit with Laura and Rob and little Richie, but I preferred when Rob got to the office. I always thought that Buddy Sorrell and Sally Rogers were the real jokers, and I wondered how Rob Petrie got to be the head writer. That's not to say that Dick Van Dyke isn't funny, but I mean, come on. Maury Amsterdam and Rose Marie were both vaudevillians, although Dick Van Dyke did some comedy too. I also liked how the creator and producer of the Dick Van Dyke Show, Carl Reiner, also appeared as Alan Brady, the star of the show that Rob and Sally and Buddy were writing for, and that you only ever saw the back of Carl Reiner's head. I loved the Dick Van Dyke Show. I love Dick Van Dyke. Poem number 1932, The Ottoman. And another thing about that show, in the opening credits, sometimes Dick Van Dyke would trip over the ottoman, and sometimes he would sidestep it. Was there ever before that time a show that had two different opening credit sequences? Maybe it's a little thing, but sometimes it's the little things that make a difference. And the last poem of the day, poem number 1933, Dick Van Dyke Show Way. In 2018, the part of Bonnie Meadow Road that the Petries lived on was renamed Dick Van Dyke Show Way. Another fun fact, Carl Reiner lived on 48 Bonnie Meadow Road, just down the street from the Petries. Rob Reiner of All in the Family and Spinal Tap fame grew up there. Gosh, when I get going on something, I can run it into the ground. I hope I didn't get too carried away today with Dick Van Dyke and Dick Van Dyke Show Way. All right, that's it. Thank you. Happy birthday, Dick Van Dyke. I appreciate you.